The officer knocked the flowers from her hands and watched them scatter across the pavement. He ordered her to pick them up, then grabbed her wrist when she stayed still. She did not shout. She did not fight back. She simply looked at him with a calmness that seemed to make the entire street feel quieter. What he didn't know was that she had already started recording everything, and within the next 60 seconds, the same officer who thought he controlled the night would realize that every word, every movement, and every second of what he had done was about to reach every screen in the city. It had been an ordinary evening for Maya Bennett, the kind of evening that should have disappeared into the thousands of forgettable moments that make up a normal life. Maya was 34, a community outreach coordinator who spent most of her days helping families find housing, organizing neighborhood programs, and delivering small acts of kindness that rarely made the news. She was not famous. She was not powerful in any way that people on the street could immediately recognize. She was simply someone who believed that showing up for people mattered. That evening, she had stopped at a small flower shop on her way home. The flowers were for her mother, whose birthday was the following morning. Maya had chosen a simple arrangement of white lilies and yellow roses, carefully wrapped in brown paper. She carried them against her chest as she walked toward her parked car, thinking about breakfast the next morning and the cake she still needed to pick up. Nothing about her appearance suggested trouble. She wore a plain dark coat, comfortable shoes, and a small shoulder bag. Her phone was inside the bag. Her keys were in her hand. Her evening was supposed to end quietly. Then a police cruiser rolled slowly to the curb. Maya noticed it, but she kept walking. The officer inside had already noticed her. At first, there was no reason for her to feel afraid. She was on a public sidewalk, carrying flowers, heading to her car. But the cruiser stopped behind her, and the officer stepped out with the kind of deliberate confidence that immediately changed the atmosphere. Maya turned. The officer looked at her, then at the flowers. What happened next began with something so small that most people nearby probably thought it was nothing. A comment. "Oh look." A few words that carried something much uglier underneath them. Maya understood the meaning immediately. She had experienced prejudice before. She knew the difference between an awkward encounter and a moment when someone's assumptions about her skin color had already decided who they believed she was. Still, she remained calm. She had no idea that within minutes, those flowers would be lying on the pavement, her wrist would be in the officer's hand, and the quiet sidewalk would become the beginning of a reckoning that neither of them could stop. And she had no idea that her phone, still inside her bag, was about to become the most important object in the entire encounter. The officer's first insult could have been dismissed as a misunderstanding. The second was harder to ignore. Then he knocked the flowers from Maya's hands. White lilies and yellow roses scattered across the pavement, their petals crushed beneath passing shoes. Maya stared down at them, then slowly looked back at the officer. She still said nothing. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. He ordered her to pick them up. She remained still. The officer stepped closer. His hand closed around her wrist. For a moment, the entire street seemed to disappear. Maya could feel the pressure of his grip, hear the traffic moving behind them, and see the small red recording light reflected on the screen of the phone inside her bag. She knew she had to stay calm, not because she was afraid of him, because she needed him to keep talking. Every insult, every threat, every movement, she wanted it recorded exactly as it happened. The officer had no idea. He believed the woman standing silently in front of him had no power in that moment. He believed the uniform gave him complete control, but Maya was counting. Not the seconds until he let go. The seconds until he realized what she was doing. And when she finally looked directly into his eyes, something about her expression changed. The confrontation was no longer about getting through the night. It was about what would happen when the truth left that sidewalk. And the officer was about to give her everything she needed. The officer's grip tightened around Maya's wrist. For the first time that night, the calm expression on his face began to crack. He seemed convinced that fear would finally make her cooperate. Instead, Maya slowly reached toward her bag with her free hand. The officer reacted immediately, but she wasn't reaching for anything dangerous. She pulled out her phone. The screen was already recording. The moment he saw it, his expression changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough. The confidence disappeared from his eyes. Maya held the phone where the camera could clearly see both of them. The recording showed the scattered flowers at their feet, the officer's hand around her wrist, and the entire confrontation that had unfolded moments earlier. The sidewalk suddenly felt different. People who had been walking past began slowing down. A driver stopped near the curb. Someone across the street raised their own phone. The officer released her wrist. But it was too late. Maya checked the recording indicator. Still running, she remained completely composed. Then she gave him a choice without raising her voice or stepping backward. He could continue pretending nothing had happened, or he could understand that every second of the encounter was already preserved. What the officer didn't realize was that the recording was not simply sitting on Maya's phone. It was already being backed up. A live copy was moving beyond that sidewalk. Within moments, someone inside the police department would be able to see what was happening. Then the officer's radio came alive. A supervisor was asking for his location. The officer looked toward the cruiser, then back at Maya. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was no longer an isolated confrontation between an officer and a woman walking home with flowers. The situation had become evidence, and then the supervisor arrived. The change was immediate. The supervisor stepped out, saw Maya, noticed the flowers scattered across the ground, and then looked at the officer's hands. He already knew something was wrong, but Maya's phone removed every excuse. The supervisor watched the recording. His expression hardened. The officer tried to explain himself, but the confidence that had filled his posture minutes earlier was gone. The supervisor looked at the footage again. Then he looked at Maya, and suddenly the entire encounter made sense. The racial insult, the humiliation, the flowers, the wrist, the assumption that she would stay silent. But there was one final detail the officer still didn't understand. Maya wasn't simply a woman with a phone. She was the person responsible for documenting misconduct complaints for the city's civilian oversight office. Her phone had been recording before the flowers ever hit the ground, and the footage had already reached the people who needed to see it. The officer stood frozen as the supervisor ordered him away from Maya. Then came the moment nobody on that sidewalk expected. The officer removed his cap, straightened his uniform, and gave Maya a formal salute. Not because he suddenly respected her, because he finally understood the consequences of what he had done. Maya looked down at the flowers scattered across the pavement. She hadn't picked them up. She didn't have to. Someone else quietly gathered them for her. And as Maya walked away, carrying the damaged bouquet against her chest, the officer remained behind, standing in the exact place where he had believed his uniform made him untouchable. But what happened to him after that night was only beginning. By the time Maya reached home, the flowers were no longer the only thing she was carrying. She carried the memory of an officer's hand around her wrist, the humiliation of being treated as though her presence alone had made her suspicious, and the realization that the uniform in front of her had not been enough to protect her from prejudice. But she also carried something else: evidence. The recording was preserved, backed up, and submitted to the city's civilian oversight office. Within days, the incident was under formal review. The officer was removed from street duty while investigators examined the footage, witness statements, and the circumstances surrounding the encounter. The recording left little room for interpretation. There was no missing context that could explain away the flowers being knocked from her hands. No misunderstanding that could erase the racial insult. No justification for grabbing her wrist after she had committed no crime. And then the story spread. What began on one quiet sidewalk became a subject of public discussion. People who had experienced similar treatment began sharing their own stories. Others who had never understood how quickly an ordinary encounter could become threatening began watching the footage with a different perspective. Maya never wanted to become famous. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted the truth to be impossible to ignore. The department eventually completed its disciplinary process. The officer was found in violation of department policy and lost his position by the end of the week. But for Maya, the most meaningful moment came later. She returned to the same flower shop. She bought another bouquet. This time, she walked toward her car without looking over her shoulder. She knew one recording could not erase racism, one disciplinary action could not fix a system, and one person's courage could not guarantee that someone else would never experience the same humiliation. But silence had not protected her that night. Documentation had, accountability had, and people willing to pay attention had. That is what makes moments like this matter. Racism does not always arrive as something loud and obvious. Sometimes it appears in an assumption, a suspicious look, a degrading comment, a decision made about someone before they are even given a chance to speak. And sometimes, the most powerful response is refusing to let that moment disappear. Maya didn't defeat prejudice that night. She simply refused to let prejudice control the ending. So the next time you see someone being humiliated because of the color of their skin, what will you do? Will you look away because it isn't happening to you? Or will you be the person who pays attention, records the truth, truth, speaks up, and refuses to let injustice become invisible? Because change doesn't begin when everyone agrees. It begins when someone decides that what happened is not acceptable and refuses to stay silent. If you believe accountability matters, share this story. And remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't powerless. Sometimes they're the one holding the evidence that changes everything.